So before I began, I thought I would give you some context about my dissertation work and about the sort of political and theoretical worries that inform my research and that inform this paper. So in its general outlines, my dissertation project is interested in constructing the groundwork for a new paradigm of domination, which is informed by the intersection of anthropocentrism and ableism, particularly under late capitalism. And this is an interdisciplinary project that brings together critical animal studies and critical disability studies through a Marxist and Foucauldian analysis of power, which I provisionally call Marxo-Foucauldian crip animal studies. So using the Foucauldian approach, I want to construe capitalism as a system that disables and animalizes, in that it produces certain bodies and subjectivities, both human and non-human, as deficient, as non-agentic and disposable through anthropocentric and ableist discourses, institutions, and practices of speciation and capacitation. And from a Marxian perspective, I want to construe capitalism as a system that exploits and consumes animal and disabled bodies as bearers and producers of value, while invisibilizing them as producers and violently excluding them from their own products and their own value production. But the intersection of critical disability studies and critical animal studies poses some unique problems. For example, there is a long history of dehumanization of disabled people in animal ethic discourse, one of the most famous being, Peter Singer's infamous argument from marginal cases, which suggests that if animals don't have moral status, then the so-called marginal cases of humanity, such as people with cognitive disabilities, shouldn't have either, or they should have both. Although it looks like it tries to secure moral status for both, because it's based on a paradigm of comparability through deficiency, the argument endangers the lives of disabled people by making their moral status debatable. And it also instrumentalizes their oppression as a means for critiquing the oppression of animals. And in response to Spiegel's 1988 book, The Dreaded Comparison, Human and Animal Slavery, which makes a similar argument at the expense of Black people, Bosseron notes that such analogizing of oppressions is harmful when it's meant to serve one cause over the other. And because of this ableist instrumentalization of disability in animal studies, but also because of its own unexamined anthropocentrism, disability studies has remained a bit distanced from animal issues, but there are now recent interventions that defy that. Animal studies, on the other hand, hasn't really deflated the problem of anthropocentrism through its paradigms of identity difference and indistinction, all of which depend on a paradigm of comparability to be intelligible. And this is what I call the problem of analogy. And my solution to the problem of analogy is to study animal oppression and disability oppression on the level of systems, multiple interlocking intersectional systems of oppression and exploitation, such as capitalism, ableism, and anthropocentrism, rather than relying on ontologically comparative paradigm. Because at the intersections of these systems, certain beings become mutually addressable, even though they're not ontologically analogizable. And I want to bracket that ontological claim because it doesn't matter ultimately if animals and disabled people can be comparable or similar, but it matters that anthropocentrism and ableism intersect and operate in similar ways. So I'd like to focus on what this mutual addressability means and what it says about these systems and how they operate and about the nature of oppression and exploitation rather than comparability. But even the best critiques of capitalism remain ableist and anthropocentric. So animals and disabled people are left out of conceptions and critiques of capitalism. So in this paper, I look at two features of capitalism, which involves animals and disabled people that are under-theorized, but I argue are central to the workings of capitalism, the rendering industry, and surplus populations. And So I want to offer this non-comparative study of how anthropocentrism and ableism inform capitalism through these, and show that theorizing these mechanisms by which capitalism at once creates and marginalizes surplus populations and disability, as well as animal bodies and labor, while obscuring their exploitation and capitalism's dependence on them, doesn't require marginal case arguments or ontological comparisons at all. My talk will be in 5 parts. In the first part, I'll talk about the rendering industry, primarily using Nicole Shukin's book, Animal Capital. In the second part, I'll talk about surplus populations, primarily using Marx's analyses from chapter 25 of Capital Volume 1, but supplementing it with newer accounts of superfluity. In part 3, I'll locate where disability can be found in surplus populations. And in part 4, I'll look at how capitalism deals with superfluity and animal death through a paradigm of profitable waste management. And finally, I'll conclude with a brief note on how rendering and surplus populations connect through disability. So the rendering industry is invisible in at least 2 senses of the word, in terms of being invisible to the public because of its removal from urban centers, but also in terms of its under-theorization in academia. With the exception of Nicole Shukin's book, Animal Capital, which centralizes the material history of rendering to construct a reinterpretation of capitalism, most publications about the industry have been published by the industry itself as a form of public relations management. And it's the name of the first book that was published by the Renderer Association in 1978. So this book and other publications represent rendering as this understated but virtuous industry of pollution prevention, recycling, and creating value out of waste, essentially. So when I first was writing this paper, I read Shukin's book and I loved it. It's a really fascinating book, but I also didn't want it to be my only source on rendering. So I went on a sort of a rabbit hole of research, which didn't yield a lot of substantial work on rendering that wasn't produced by the industry. But I did stumble upon an episode of a Discovery Channel program called Dirty Jobs, which had a segment on rendering. And this program was also made from the perspective of the rendering industry, but it revealed, I think, a lot about what the industry wants to represent itself. And a close reading of this segment and what it chooses to include and what it carefully excludes says a lot about the industry. And I think it's a good introduction to some of the themes I'm going to talk about with regards to Shukin's book. So I'll start with that. I unfortunately don't have access to this episode anymore, so I won't be able to show you anything. So this American television series called Dirty Jobs was aired for 9 seasons on the Discovery Channel between 2005 and 2012. And the premise of the show is that the show's host, Mike Rowe, performs as an apprentice for 1 day alongside blue-collar workers who are doing what Mike Rowe calls disgusting, difficult, gross, dangerous jobs. And the refrain from the show's jingle, "It's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it," kind of conveys the sense that undervalued but essential blue-collar jobs make civilized life possible. And while animal rendering is featured in only 1 segment, when you look at the list of episodes out of 173 that aired, almost every episode includes some segments which involve jobs that capitalize on animal remains, animal death, or animal exploitation in some way. And I put a short list of some of what they look like bat cave scavenging, ostrich farming, hunting bloodworms, dairy cow insemination, vellum making, mobile meat processing, sheep castration, and many, many more. And dirty jobs that are not associated with extracting value out of animals are about a form of cleaning or recycling. And a significant number of those are about waste management in the form of picking up after some other major industry, such as mine plugging, which is the safe closing down of a decommissioned mine, for instance. And rendering does both, in that it extracts value from animal remains and it cleans up after the meat industry's enormous waste. So the segment begins with showing how the rendering plant services nearby farms by going around in this dead truck, as they call it, picking up bloated carcasses of farm animals, which are said to have died of natural causes. The plant actually also renders remains from restaurants, slaughterhouses, and supermarkets, but the procurement of these remains are not shown. And the segment is carefully framed around the rendering process of a number of cows picked up from the farm. So that's the narrative arc that the episode follows. When the cows first enter the facility, they're skinned and their hides are sent to a tannery, which is another supplementary industry that capitalizes on animal remains. And the rest of the animal goes through the rendering process to produce oil and animal feed mainly. And this emphasis on the processing of farm animals helps portray the place of the renderers in the food chain as a dutiful garbage collector of natural death, like carrion animals in nature. But fallen farm animals, as the rendering industry euphemistically refers to them, are not the only source of raw material for the industry. They actually make up only 4% of all the rendered animal material. Integrated rendering plants get their material exclusively from slaughterhouses and poultry processing plants, but independent ones, such as the one featured in this segment, exploit a variety of sources, such as butcher shops, supermarkets, restaurants, fast food chains, farms, ranches, feedlots, and animal shelters, but also roadkill, euthanized pets, zoo animals, culled wildlife, and others. And this is just an incomplete inventory of the many ways animals are rendered capital by humans. And this is not included in the segment. And the slight shift serves to occlude the enormity of the carnage that the industry feeds off of and how many other industries it's connected to, while it claims to lay bare all the uncomfortable details about the process. And this discomfort with the process is addressed by the host numerous times, especially in the speech that I'm going to read to you from the end. And here, the host seems to brace against possible critical or effective reactions by pointing out the complacency of the average viewer, but also how the industry serves society in both material and symbolic ways. So Mike Rowe says, "You saw difficult things, maybe you were mad, but listen, the cows were already dead when we found them. They could have gone to the landfill, but instead they came here to be rendered, and I'm glad they did. We took off their hides so you can have your shoes and your boots and your belts to keep your pants up. We extracted all of their juices to make a high quality grease to help keep our polite society lubricated. And what is left is pure, unadulterated cow, or in this case, chicken feed." So the speech, I think, captures the gist of how the rendering wishes to represent itself. It's imbued with the sense of inevitability. The cows are already dead. We found them. So it's a part of how the industry naturalizes its operations by obscuring the prior exploitation and killing of animals and the organized effort of procuring animal remains. They don't find them, they actively procure them. And also represents as fulfilling our natural role in the life cycle of animals, as if it's inevitable for animals to be especially bred, worked, exploited, and killed prematurely in the service of humans. And it underscores the recycling function. If the industry doesn't pick them up, they'll become pollutants in landfills. But going beyond this waste management service, they also extract capital and generate value out of waste, and transforms waste and death into a lucrative and lively business by turning animal remains into various products used in several industries, including mundane ones like belts. So this last part makes the viewers implicated, but since the industry has a symbolic function entangled with the material one, keeping polite society decent, keeping their pants up figuratively and literally. So someone does this dirty job so that others can have their clean and shiny shoes, which have lost their connection to their violent past. And finally, the last product mentioned is chicken feed, which gestures at the tautological closed loop created. Processed animal remains are fed to other captive animals and domestic pets, many of which will end up in a rendering facility after their death. The characterization of the final product as pure, unadulterated cow signals that the ultimate role of the industry is the purifying one. The dirty business of rendering purifies itself by turning death into profit and waste into use value, by literally transforming the putrid, leaky, and maggoty carcass into odorless brown dry matter. So from this segment, I extracted some features that represent the rendering industry, which are going to be relevant to the discussion that's going to follow. One of them is the decentralization of animals in the show, although they're featured almost in every episode. And the naturalizing tendency, the industry naturalizing itself and naturalizing animal death. The emphasis on the virtuous recycle rather than profit as the main function of the industry. The treatment of the industry as posterior to other industries that kill and exploit animal bodies, and relieving those industries and end users of moral burden. The entanglement of the industry's symbolic and material operations, and finally, the closed loop of rendering. So to explore further implications, I'm going to turn to Shukin's book, Animal Capital, which presents an alternative genealogy of capitalism, where the disassembly of animal bodies and traffic in animal substances feature heavily in making possible the reproduction of capitalist hegemony, and where, as Shukin says, the social bios is materially contingent upon and continuous with the lives of non-human others. So the project of the book is to focalize the animal in order to locate both the material and symbolic ways animal becomes capital and capital becomes animal. A similar study could be conducted by focusing on other more obviously central industries that depend on exploitation and eradication of animal lives. But focusing on rendering gives Shukin's work a double edge. Through the double entendre of rendering, which both means the boiling down of animal remains, as well as the mimetic work of reproduction, Shukin wants to capture the sense in which biopolitics reproduces life both materially and symbolically. The double sense of rendering also allows to track down the material conditions of post-industrial forms of capital, which may appear dematerialized and dissociated from material bodies and relations. And finally, this approach troubles a certain periodization of the history of capitalism from industrial capitalism and traditional labor formats to more immaterial forms of capital like finance and information. But Shukin's approach accommodates a more discursive aspect of current capitalism without losing sight of how they're contingent on material bodies and labor. One of the examples that Shukin used, one of the many examples she uses, is while cinema is regarded as marking the passage from industrial to post-industrial modes of production, or from material labor to immaterial labor, Shukin shows how gelatin, which is a product of rendering, was materially central to the early development of film stock, literally making modern photographic and filmic mimesis possible. Secondly, the rendering industry demonstrates David Harvey's concept of accumulation by dispossession, which explains how capital has a tendency to colonize that which is outside itself and that which is inside, but seems like it cannot be further excavated for profit. One example of this is privatization of the commons, for instance. And while this form of accumulation has intensified in recent decades, it's not particular to the post-industrial phase of capitalism. Returning animal remains and waste for another capitalizing round through its closed loops, the rendering industry. Sorry? Okay, I'm going. The rendering industry characterizes an ever-renewing potential of capital to extend its material grounds beyond the limits of non-renewable resources. And this radicalizes capitalist production and consumption. And this aggressive capitalization of formerly non-capitalized sectors and areas can be traced back to industrial capitalism through the ongoing material history of rendering. Another thing that Shukin study does is to denature the notion of recycling and the concept of waste. So this is a quote from Shukin's book that I'm going to read. Rather than being simply posterior to mass production, recovering what is left over after economic exploitation, the rendering of animal byproducts is arguably entwined in the material and discursive conditions of possibility of modern capitalism. It is important to counterintuitively consider the rendering of waste as a condition as well as an effect of the pace and scale of industrial capitalism. More than just mopping up after capital has made a killing, the rendering industry promises the possibility of an infinite resubjection of nature to capital. While rendering appears to be a byproduct, the vast number of products that result from the process that are used in numerous industries turn out to be more profitable than what is supposedly the main product, meat. Shukin states that the packing industry would not be turning a profit without the supplementary industry of rendering, because it was only as byproducts that animals returned as capital. In the cattle economy of the 19th century, for instance, meat was the waste product in a market centered around hides and tallow, which shows that the universal value for animals is not eternal, but historical. And today, even though meat has gone from waste to main product, the understated rendering industry serves as a major capital-making force. So the rendering industry makes possible and is made possible by modern capitalism's drive for the total capitalization of nature, according to Shukin, or a tautological system of capitalized nature closed back on itself. And this tautology is contingent upon not only literal rendering, but also the discursive production of nature as participatory subject in this process. So we've already seen this desire for the total mimicry of nature in the rendering episode, where the industry represented itself as fulfilling the role of almost a scavenging animal, recycling natural death. And this naturalization tendency of the industry on the semiotic register is parallel to the material move towards the tautological subsumption of nature by literally boiling it down to smaller and smaller bits for the extraction of further profit. And in connection with the naturalizing tendency, which already involves a tightly controlled management of animal bodies and remains, another aspect of the biopolitics of late capitalism, which shows up in rendering, is the containment and management of affects aroused by potential identification with animal others. This involves the innovation and employment of various material technologies and processes to spirit away all sensible traces of the historical, that is, dying animal. This is reflected both materially and symbolically in the entire process that turns the rotting corpse of the animal into odorless brown powder at the end of the dirty job segment. The discursive operation turns the prior domination and destruction of animal bodies into recycled products that keep society decent through degrees of symbolic and physical removal. According to Shukin, this marks a shift in material and symbolic conditions of capital from a predominantly raw diet of so-called first nature to one increasingly contingent on recycled nature or cooked nature. Recycled nature is potentially endlessly renewable as a resource frontier for capital, but it also signifies civilization and refinement and a certain distance from its material roots. So in short, Shukin aims to show that capitalism, both in its industrial and post-industrial iterations, depend on the symbolic and material subsumption of animal capital and the non-criminal domination and killing of animals. So Shukin's study of rendering challenges anthropocentric critiques of capitalism. It also opens the way for a critique of the way a narrow concept of labor has been employed as the sole marker of exploitation. As with animal capital that involves the non-labor-centric extraction of value from animal death, late capitalism in its intensifying recapitalization of its internal resources engages with a similar non-labor-centric exploitation of human bare life, which is similarly governed by logics of waste management. And just as the enormous waste of animal death becomes a problem of absorption by nature, providing rationale for the rendering industry, the growing number of people becoming unexploitable and redundant become a problem of absorption for capital, providing rationale for spatial and institutional control. The proliferation of spaces of exception like ghettos, slums, refugee camps, hospitals, and prisons for surplus populations echoes animal spaces of exception like zoos, agro-industrial farms, and scientific labs, since urban space at the advent of industrial capitalism, which was structured around the double invisibilization of human poverty and suffering, through segregating the working poor in ghettos and manufacturing districts, or by locating slaughterhouses away from city centers. So both of these processes of dealing with the problem of absorption and these spaces of exception become ways of extracting profit and capital out of non-labor and non-productivity. In a joint study of animals and surplus populations, Hudson notes that the non-human animal occupies a liminal space, at once within and outside the sphere of production, never allowed to be an active participant in the system, though determined by it. which is the position increasingly occupied by more than 1 billion humans excluded from labor and production. Just as the logic of recycling embodied by rendering does not offer a redemptive or subversive challenge to capitalist hegemony, but rather supplements the sustainability thereof, the critique of capitalism from the standpoint of labor might reinforce and affirm the production process of capitalism. So now I want to turn to surplus populations, which are another phenomenon of capitalism that can bridge both the industrial and post-industrial periods of capitalism, while also highlighting what's distinctive to both. So unlike rendering, surplus populations have received some recent interest because the phenomenon has become undeniable, I think, post-70s, post-industrial form of capitalism, the increase in both proletarianization and surplusization is very obvious. But members of surplus populations who are rendered absolutely redundant, such as disabled people, are invisibilized even by those theorizing surplus populations and precarity, just like animal capital is largely ignored by those theorizing capitalism. This partially stems from the fact that newer studies of surplus populations mostly omit Marx's stagnant layer, which includes disability and other forms of non-capital producing kinds of survival under capitalism. So my strategy is to centralize Marx's account and enrich it with further sublayers, which better accommodate the recent phase of capitalism. According to Marx, surplus populations are not just a necessary product of the development of capitalist wealth, but at the same time, the lever of capitalistic accumulation and the very condition of the existence of the capitalist mode of production. So just as rendering is not a simple byproduct of the packing industry, but actually a central component of renewing the resource frontiers of capitalism, surplus populations are not unfortunate byproducts of population increase or resource depletion. As Marx says, capitalism produces poverty no matter what the state or rate of population growth, because the permanent pool of unemployed laborers is socially necessary for accumulation to continue to expand. The reserve army of labor expands and retracts in response to the needs of capital expansion, as Marx says, as a mass of human material always ready for exploitation. So these choice of words, mass of human material, and also reserve army, signal a state of being undifferentiated, indistinct, raw material, energy reserve or resource that lies dormant and is managed and kept containerized until capitalism excavates it or processes it for profit, much like the mass of animal material that turns into use value through rendering. As this animal material can only accumulate under conditions of anthropocentric domination and captivity of animals, surplus populations can only accumulate in a mode of production where labor is captive to capital and where the worker does not own the means of production and has to work for the valorization of capital in order to survive. Since capital accumulates by turning the unpaid portion of wage labor into capital, it needs wage labor. But ironically, the working population also produces the conditions that renders itself superfluous to capital. According to the Endnotes collective, this expresses one of the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production. And I quote from them: on the one hand, people in capitalist social relations are reduced to workers. On the other hand, they cannot be workers, since by working, they undermine the conditions of the possibility of their own existence. Wage labor is inseparable from the accumulation of capital, from the accretion of labor-saving innovations, which over time reduce the demand for labor. According to Marx, the general law of capitalist accumulation dictates that the very same causes that develop the expansive power of capital also create a disposable kind of reserve labor whose relative mass increases in response to the increase in wealth. But the greater the surplus population, the greater is the number of people who are absolutely redundant and pauperized. And to quote Marx, whose misery is an inverse ratio to its torment of labor. So those who are miserable not because of labor exploitation, but precisely because it's not exploited. Or as Michael Denning says, under capitalism, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. Because in a system of complete market dependency, where one is obligated to sell their labor to survive, exclusion from labor is oppressive and violent. So in the post-70s neoliberal restructuring of the global economy, coupled with deindustrialization and de-agrarianization, we've seen a wholesale surplusization of world populations to the extent that now unemployment has become the norm rather than the exception. So although they've now proliferated to an undeniable intensity, surplus populations have been a pivotal part of capitalism since the beginning. And so just as the centralization of animal exploitation and domination in capitalism troubles the periodization criteria of capitalism, similarly, so does a focus on surplus populations. Because surplus populations and animal domination have been features of capitalism since the time of enclosures and primitive accumulation. The double throng of primitive accumulation and accumulation by dispossession alienated agricultural workers from land through enclosures to make wage labor and factory work possible, on the one hand, and secured land and resources for capital through violent colonialism on the other. Enclosures, however, did not merely free workers from land, they were also the beginning of artificial conditions under which animals lived in an ever-amplified form ever since then. As Hudson says, contemporary factory farming intensifies animal enclosure, removing livestock from their outdoor enclosures to barren, crowded stalls and factory conditions. Here, animals cease to represent domesticated nature, becoming instead representatives of an industrial production process that reduces all life to bare life. So this bare lifeization has continued to be the case for both animals and humans during post-industrial material conditions of capitalism. Another connection between surplus populations and animal rendering is the tautological loop that the process creates through its form of resource extraction. Surplus population is a dynamic entity that swells and shrinks with the accumulative cycles of capital. As Marx says, every laborer belongs to it during the time he's only partially employed or wholly employed. That is to say, every worker is a virtual pauper. Everyone who's not a member of the capital-owning or land-owning class is caught within the loop between virtual and actual pauperism, and different segments of the surplus population, depending on the expansion and contraction cycles of capital. And capitalism cashes in on this tautological process, which supplies an endlessly renewing labor and non-labor resource frontier. Capitalism further profits from this closed loop through a biopolitics of waste management, which includes immensely profitable technologies and industries of warehousing, institutionalization, medicalization, and criminalization, as well as through the creation of services and products that seemingly cater to but further exploit such populations. So due to the period in which he was writing, Marx's account lacks certain aspects of current surplus populations, such as consideration of informal economies and the service sector, which were not as prominent back then. Newer studies of superfluity omit Marx's detailed stagnant layer where we find disability, so I centralize Marx's account, and then I'll add some new sub-layers so that we can examine surplus populations on a more global level with analyses of colonialism entangled history with capitalism as well. So Marx divides surplus populations into mainly three layers: floating, latent, and stagnant. The floating surplus population consists of those already proletarianized full-time wage workers who are temporarily out of work because of the conditions of accumulation and who will be the first to be reabsorbed once conditions approve. So this population is what official unemployment statistics capture. The latent surplus populations are those who have not been completely proletarianized. During the time Marx wrote, this referred to peasant populations. But since then, de-agrarianization, proletarianization of rural areas, and destruction of indigenous subsistence agricultural systems and other factors have been pushing these populations into the workforce and then pushing them to superfluity afterwards. And according to David Harvey, the latent layer represents a huge and diverse category of people potentially available everywhere, and the geopolitics of access to it through imperialist and colonial practices can play a very significant role, and corresponds to various social groups and their intersecting oppressions, such as gender and race. For instance, McIntyre finds that race is an important factor of being in latent and stagnant strata of surplus populations rather than floating. From the very beginning of European imperial expansion, colonialism, and slavery, race has marked populations whose labor is unfree and surplus producing. With the abolition of slavery, race continues to mark formerly unfree laboring populations who now become the core of capitalism's surplus laboring population. So the stagnant layer is the most difficult to be absorbed by capital. This is the sphere of pauperism. Marx further subdivides the sphere into those able to work, those who can be easier mobilized into the other spheres, and those unable to work. And this latter category includes the disabled, not only in the sense of impairment, but also in the social sense of disablement, which results from the division of labor. So Marx says about the stagnant layer that they are the demoralized and ragged, those unable to work, chiefly people who succumb to their incapacity for adaptation due to the division of labor, people who've passed the normal age of labor, victims of industry whose number increases with the increase of dangerous machinery, of mines, chemical works, etc., the mutilated, the sickly, the widows, etc. So he doesn't use the word disability because it didn't really exist at the time. And Marx also adds lumpenproletariat, or what he called dangerous classes, who are able but won't work, in a sense. But Marx's insight of adding them to surplus populations, excluded from capital-labor relationship, can prove useful in constructing a model of the informal economy that increasingly characterizes ways of surviving in late neoliberal capitalism. Another addition that I'm making to Marx's superfluity is the informal sector, which didn't exist in Marx's time in the same scale that it is today. According to Mike Davis, during the 1980s, the informal sector employment grew 2 to 5 times faster than formal sector jobs and inverted their relative structural positions. Service work is another sector that grew in the wake of deindustrialization. While unpaid reproductive labor and paid service work existed during Marx's time, Marx did not regard these as surplus producing, or surplus value producing, rather. But McIntyre notes that consistent with capitalism's tendency to turn everything into a commodity, reproductive labor and personal service can also be turned into surplus producing wage labor. And the service sector is really interesting because it intersects with both formal and informal work, further underscoring this dynamicism of the superfluity loop between virtual and actual pauperization. Marx's model focused on how surplus populations were an internal or a local product of capitalist accumulation, but Harvey and others extend the logic of enclosures and dispossession to the geographical expansion of capital across the globe, creating international surplus populations. And as a result of this increasing universalization and totalization of the capitalist mode of production, the majority of the world's population is being rendered labor-dependent or proletarianized, and then increasingly superfluous in the past couple decades. And now I'd like to look at where we can find disability in surplus populations. Benanav estimates the global surplus population to be around 1.3 billion people, which accounts for roughly 40% of the world's workforce. This is data from 2014, so I think these numbers are much higher now, especially since the pandemic. But still, even this number is quite staggering, which was nearly 1 in 6 people at the time, and it can't be considered a negligible minority. And interestingly, the global number of the disabled is almost around the same figure, which is 1.2 to 1.4 billion, according to United Nations. And since we roughly know the percentage of disability unemployment, we can calculate the intersection of global surplus populations and global disability. And it turns out to be around 60%. Even without consideration of other layers of surplus populations, at least 800 million disabled people are unemployed, making the majority of global surplus populations disabled. So the condition of disabled workers reflect larger shifts in global capitalism, like the industrialization and shift to an informal and service economy, but being a part of an oppressed group selects them for further marginalization. So either the disabled remain largely out of the workforce and thus non-exploited in the strict sense, so remaining in the stagnant layer, or they're employed in informal, precarious part-time work, which, since we added this to our layers of surplus populations, also selects them for fluctuating between latent and stagnant layers. So according to several disability scholars, disability emerges as a category of difference, exclusion, and bodily non-normativity around the advent of industrial capitalism. And the argument is that the sort of speedy, disciplined, highly productive factory work excluded certain bodies that could have been better integrated to pre-capitalist societies, which might have demanded a different version of the body, a different sense of time, and flexible modes of production. But capitalism also creates literal impairment through unsafe work conditions, especially low pay, informal service, or other precarious kinds of work, and other capitalism-related historical and economic contexts like enslavement and colonization create disablement alongside racialization. Disability scholar Davidson suggests that a global consideration of disability requires taking into consideration the disabling effects of wars, poverty, violence, dangerous industries, national debts, labor migration, and ethnic displacement, as well as the global lack of access to adequate healthcare, safe drinking water, and nutritious food. And all of these issues are equally pertinent to consideration of surplus populations, of which disabled people make up the majority. In short, whether it is in its industrial or imperialist form, capitalism is a system that seems to produce disability and superfluity. And so how does capitalism deal with superfluity and disability? When ableist society and capital can't absorb surplus populations or integrate the disabled, they increasingly manage these populations through logics of waste management and warehousing, predominantly through routes of medicalization or criminalization. When this biopolitical management does not exploit in a strict Marxist sense of extracting surplus value out of the unpaid portion of labor, capital extracts immense profit and value out of the warehousing of these populations through the privatization and marketization of the institutions involved and the services that these institutions deliver. Holden and Beresford analyzed the internationalization and privatization of social care for the disabled as a characteristic of the era of capitalism defined by accumulation by dispossession, where privatization becomes a new and important mechanism of accumulation. So NGOs, voluntary organizations, and charities that focus on disability increasingly operate according to the criteria of for-profit firms to capture and retain market shares, while also receiving government subsidies like private operations. And disability is big business with nearly $400 billion a year in the US alone. This is data from 2007, with similar trends in other industrial countries. The pharmaceutical industry, as well as managed care companies and insurance companies, are a big part of the disability business, making extraordinary profits. And the disability market is global, with many of these kinds of firms operating on every continent, and some of them making more profits outside than the original industrial country of origin. And this demonstrates just how profitable this business is, although it's ultimately fueled by its very vulnerable customers. Albrecht and Bury disproved the idea that the disabled are redundant to capital when they're not exploited in the traditional sense. And similarly, Russell and Stewart's work on disability and superfluity shows that in both medicalized and criminalized sectors of warehousing and institutionalization, exclusion of disabled people from wage labor does not mean they were ignored as a source of profit. So this is a quote from them: when a single impaired body generates $30,000 to $82,000 in annual revenues, Wall Street brokers count that body as an asset, which contributes to a nursing home chain's net worth. From the point of view of the capitalist care industry, disabled people are worth more to the gross domestic product when occupying an institutional bed than they are in their own homes. According to Russell and Stewart, people with disabilities were excluded out of the workforce and turned into non-productive problem populations to be controlled through institutionalization and segregation. If some of this confinement is taking place through medicalization of disabled bodies and the disability care business, some of it is taking place in prisons, which function as warehouse facilities for surplus populations and poorest classes. As a result of deinstitutionalization and the subsequent criminalization of mental illnesses, the pauperization of people with disabilities, as well as the disability-producing violent systems of racism and capitalism, prisons house a disproportionate number of people with disabilities, poor people, and people of color. Given their increasing privatization and marketization, as well as cheap prison labor of their captive populations, prisons are also a source of profit. Most prisons are actually public institutions, but they're also marketized and they generate profit through the construction and management of the facilities themselves. So in short, I try to show how the logic of rendering and logic of surplus populations are both central but disavowed features of capitalism, which when examined closely reveal how anthropocentric and ableist workings of late capitalism render both animal and human lives as non-productive ways to be managed and absorbed while continuously exploiting them through this non-labor-centric but still material process. And looking at these closely can maybe give us a fuller picture of capitalism while also providing us with a systemic method of studying both animality and disability without the perils of the comparative paradigm. I just want to conclude with a short note on how rendering and surplus populations further connect through disability in several ways. For instance, in the animal industry, animals are bred to be disabled, but some of these disabilities, like large breasts on chickens, are desirable and capitalizable, whereas some of these diseases and disabilities are not, which lead to the killing of these animals. But since animals were killed because of disease or disability, including so-called natural deaths, are sent through the rendering industry, ultimately these deaths are also capitalized in this closed loop. So ultimately, profit can be extracted from manufactured disability. As animals are manufactured to be disabled or are inadvertently disabled through the horrendous conditions of the industry, labor is similarly manufactured to be redundant. While most of the redundant are disabled, it is also the case that poverty and lack of access is a source of literal and social disablement. In the case of animals, their deaths are rendered non-criminal. There is supposedly no killing but recycling. In the case of surplus populations and disablement, there is supposedly no exploitation but warehousing. But both are ultimately managed through a biopolitics of waste management under ableist and anthropocentric self-valorization of capital, which ultimately extracts value out of their lives and deaths and treats them as masses of material and reserves of energy that can be endlessly renewed through tautological loops of superfluity and rendering. So that's all I have to say for now. Thank you for listening.